Thank you. I have some preliminary comments that I hope might simplify the task that is before us, before you. It seems to me that there was no great problem with the process for accrediting indigenous groups to participate in the permanent forum and in the expert mechanism and in several other bodies from time to time. The sole problem that was raised during the process of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was the problem faced by indigenous governments that were not able to get an appropriate status for participating in the United Nations, and it was that problem in particular, the problem of indigenous governments, that the outcome document of the World Conference intended to address. I think some of the submissions, particularly submissions by states, have taken the approach that the whole system of accrediting indigenous groups and organizations needs to be reworked and rebuilt entirely. But I think that is a very difficult and complex job, and it risks making things worse. It risks upsetting a system that is in fact working fairly well right now. I say it is working fairly well. It's working fairly well except for indigenous governments. I think if the General Assembly ultimately can address the question of participation by indigenous governments, that will solve the particular problem that we need to address, and we can lay aside other matters until there's a demonstrated need for adjusting those procedures. I realize that I'm jumping ahead, but I understand we were invited to do so in the interest of time. On the question of accrediting indigenous governments, first of all, I'm uncomfortable with this term selection as opposed to the term accreditation. Selection seems to imply that there will be choosing going on, as if some will be chosen and some rejected. But I don't think anyone actually means that. I think everyone is talking about accreditation rather than selection, as I understand the word. So I hope that we can agree that that is the process we're talking about. I think it might be a contribution to say that I believe there are three elements that should be the focus of inquiry in the accreditation process. It is necessary to be sure that entities that are not indigenous, that are not governments, and that do not represent indigenous peoples do not come here masquerading and pretending to be such. That would be very disadvantageous to all indigenous peoples. So I think the accrediting body is going to have to ask that a group applying for accreditation demonstrate, number one, that it represents a people, that there is a people with shared bonds of history, culture, language, and location, something of that nature. Number two, the group seeking accreditation should demonstrate that it is indigenous, not just some group that wants to take advantage of that convenient title. There is no formal definition of indigenous, but there is a lot of international practice and a great deal of understanding of the use of that term in international practice, and applicants should demonstrate that they are indigenous. Number three, and this is the third focus, the applicant should demonstrate that it is indeed a government that's duly established by the people it purports to represent. I think that when such an indigenous government is accredited, it can then designate what individuals it chooses to represent it in UN proceedings. I think the accrediting body can, of course, request what information it feels is necessary to establish these three primary facts: whether the applicant is a people, whether they are indigenous, and whether there is, in fact, a duly constituted government. Thank you for this opportunity to make these comments.